Hello, all. Welcome to yet another enriching session. In today's lecture, we're going to discuss a very important macronutrient that has a negative connotation attached to it in today's context. You guessed it right, carbohydrates. When we think about carbohydrate in today's context, we often associate it with sluggish feeling and weight gain. But what we forget in the process is it still acts as primary fuel for energy production. So the idea of today's lecture is to emphasize importance of carbohydrates, why to include them in diet. We'll talk a little bit about carbohydrate digestion and conclude it by talking about some carbohydrates that need to be avoided or should be restricted. So, are you ready to dive in with me? Talk about any food, we first need to understand why it is needed for our body. So, carbohydrates, they fulfill three primary roles in our body. First role played by them is they act as primary source of fuel for energy production. There are certain organs like brain and muscles that rely on glucose as source for energy production. The second one is structural component. They form part of structural biological molecules that are important, like your DNA and RNA. DNA, we all know, is deoxyribonucleic acid, and RNA is ribonucleic acid. DNA is made of deoxyribose and nitrogen base. RNA is made of ribose sugar and nitrogen base. So these sugar molecules, they are 5 carbon atoms. Finally, when carbohydrates come together with protein and lipids, they form glycoproteins and glycolipids, which are important components of cell membrane, and they are responsible for imparting cell membrane barrier function. Now, carbohydrates can be classified into several types depending on degree of polymerization. They can be classified into simple sugars, oligosaccharides, and polysaccharides. So under simple sugars, you have monosaccharides and disaccharides. Monosaccharide is made of only one type of sugar. For instance, you have glucose, you have galactose, you have fructose. When two of these monosaccharide units come together, it can be same or different. It forms disaccharide. So they come together via glycosidic linkage. For example, you have sucrose, which is made of fructose and glucose. You have galactose and glucose making your lactose. Monosaccharides, they are sweet and they are generally soluble in water, even disaccharides, meaning simple sugars. Second comes your oligosaccharide, they have a degree of polymerization between 2 to 9. So 2 to 9 simple sugar molecules come together via glycosidic linkage to form oligosaccharide. Example, you have raffinose and stachyose. They are present in leguminous plants. Okay, and this is responsible for conferring gasiness when you consume legumes. Finally, you have polysaccharide. You can look at the structure and tell itself that it's very complex. You have more than 9 monosaccharide units coming together via glycosidic linkage. Because of this complex structure, it is generally insoluble in water. And it does not have any taste. If you talk about energy production, what is used as source is simple sugars, either your monosaccharide or disaccharide. Now let's understand carbohydrate digestion. When you take foods rich in carbohydrates, what happens is carbohydrate digestion begins in the mouth itself because of presence of an enzyme called salivary amylase. Salivary amylase breaks down starch to give glucose. Glucose then enters bloodstream and it is distributed to different organelles involved in some sort of activity because glucose enters Krebs cycle oxidative phosphorylation to yield ATP, which can then be utilized by the organ or organelles. Suppose after a meal you have high blood glucose concentration, then brain signals your stomach pancreatic cells to release a hormone called insulin, which converts glucose to glycogen. Glycogen is then stored in liver and muscles. So glycogen acts as an energy reserve for energy production later on when you indulge in an activity. Later on, when you want to carry out some activity, playing, studying, reading, sleeping, that time glycogen is converted back to glucose with help of another hormone called glucagon, released again by pancreatic cells. And then your glucose enters your glycolysis, Krebs cycle, oxidative phosphorylation to yield ATP. Now, a question may arise when we consume carbohydrates, how much energy is released per gram of carbohydrate? We get approximately 4 kilocalorie per gram of energy from carbohydrates. Even today, when we talk about carbohydrate, it is important to include them in our diet because half of the energy that is produced by glucose is utilized by brain for its proper functioning. The classification of carbohydrates that's of utmost importance to us as consumers. Carbohydrates can be divided into simple carbs and complex carbs. Simple carbs means they can be easily digested by stomach and intestinal enzymes. So you have simple sugars, monosaccharides like glucose, galactose, fructose. You also have disaccharides. They all fall under simple carbs. Okay, you usually get it by consuming candied sugar or sugared candy, and also honey, things like honey, which is direct source of sugar. What they end up doing is, because they are digested fast, they can increase immediately your blood glucose level, so they are categorized as high glycemic index foods. On the other hand, you have complex carbohydrates, which are derived by consuming fruits, vegetables, legumes. They cannot be broken down easily by intestinal enzymes. So what happens to them? They travel to the colon. In the colon, they are acted upon by the gut microbiota. But this process is longer. As a result, what happens is you feel much fuller for longer periods of time. And the glucose spike also happens gradually. That's why they are classified as low glycemic index foods. These days, with advancement of food science and technology, it is important that you understand what type of carbohydrate should be had in restricted amount or should be avoided if possible. The first type is refined sugar, excessively refined sugar, okay, that can be avoided, even that present in sugared candy, honey, etc. The second one is refined grains. You know that pasta, whole wheat pasta is better than white pasta. Whole wheat chapati is better than your normal chapati. Processed snacks like chips, okay, consuming it on a daily basis is not advisable. Finally, you have hidden carbs in certain products like your tomato sauce. Tomato sauce, you have some amount of sugar added to extend its shelf life. Having said that, it does not mean that you completely avoid having carbohydrates. You can still go in for a low glycemic complex carbohydrate rich diet. Okay, because carbohydrates, they are still required by your body. If you don't consume enough carbohydrate, they contribute to almost 40 to 50% of energy produced. That is immense. Okay, that is immense considering 1500 kilocalorie to 2000 kilocalorie diet. If you don't have it, it can result in weakness and fatigue. And in the long run, it can also cause hypoglycemia, ketosis, and mucopolysaccharidosis. So the idea is to have carbohydrate, all the three macronutrients in moderation in the form of balanced diet. If you have any queries regarding today's lecture, let me know in the comment. Thank you.